Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Whispers. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from. Also, give a like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. I live in middle of nowhere, Great Plains, aka northwestern South Dakota. It's not the worst place to live, I guess, if you like corn, but as you can imagine, not a lot goes on up here. Not much changes in my static little world, but when something new emerges from the monotony, I take notice, as in the case of the sign I saw about 3 years ago. It was a Friday night in late October, and I was driving home from a party at around 10 p.m. I had just reached the most isolated portion of my drive, a winding forest road that has more deer than cars using it on any given day, when my headlights illuminated a flyer posted to the trunk of an elm tree. As I passed by, I saw the words "Lost Dog," along with a photo, presumably of the animal in question. Now, the location of the flyer was already strange enough to give me pause, but from my brief glimpse, the photo was even stranger. Maybe I was tired from a long day, or maybe the printer had messed up that particular flyer, but the picture hadn't looked like a dog at all, more so like a random assortment of shapes. Like I said, not much happens in my town, and the flyer was probably the most interesting thing that I'd seen all month. There was a turnout just after the elm, so I slowed down, pulled over, and stopped my car. I grabbed the flashlight I always keep in my console and got out to take a look. The flyer was even stranger up close. For one thing, there was no contact information, and the reward seemed exorbitant for another. The photo itself was also bizarre. Do you remember that AI-generated image shared on Twitter a couple years back with the caption, "Name one thing in this photo"? That's what the so-called dog reminded me of. A bunch of colors and shapes that looked like they should have been recognizable, but weren't. It had a short description of the dog beneath the photo. John Shepherd, mix white coat, brown hood, blue eyes. $10,000. Weird name for a dog. I chalked it up to an art piece, which helped dispel some of the unease that had begun to build in me upon staring at the photo. A part of me wanted to take the flyer, but I didn't want to be selfish with the artist's work, so I contented myself with the photo. Just as I slipped my phone back into my pocket, the sound of snapping twigs made me start. Maybe the deer want to look at the art too, I thought, shining my flashlight into the trees. I waited for a moment, scanning the forest with bated breath. But even though it had sounded like there was an animal right behind me, I saw nothing. I returned to my car after that and continued home. The next day, I gave my buddy Eric a call, hoping to catch him for drinks at our favorite brewery. Halfway through the call, I remembered the photo I'd taken of the lost dog flyer and opened my photo gallery so I could send it to him. To my disappointment, the photograph I'd taken was completely black. Either I'd had my thumb over the lens, or the photo had somehow gotten corrupted. It was a little strange, but I've never been very tech-savvy, so I dismissed it as a glitch and told Eric where to look if he was ever returning to town from that direction. As it turned out, I didn't have to wait until my next out-of-town drive to see the flyer again. The following evening, Eric and I were walking back to our cars from the brewery. Across the street, stapled to a telephone pole, I noticed a familiar flyer and quickly pulled him over to point out the artwork. I was all smiles as I showed him, excited that someone was using our town as a canvas for their project, and even more excited that I'd been one of the first to notice it. This flyer was just as devoid of information as the first, and featured the same abstract mess of shapes for its dog. Eric's always been more cultured than myself, more inclined to be interested in art history and that sort of thing, so I was interested to hear his take on the piece. When I turned to get his reaction, though, he looked more unsettled than amused. "What up?" I asked him. Instead of answering, he just shook his head. "Nah, man, you'll think I'm crazy." I tried pressing him a bit more, but when it became clear that he wasn't going to divulge the source of his apprehension, I let it go. Before I continued towards my car, I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo of my shoes, which showed up in my photo gallery without issue. Then I pointed my phone at the flyer, aimed, pressed the capture button, and nothing. Again, the photograph was completely black. When I got home that night, I went down a rabbit hole of anti-surveillance patterns, aka designs created for the express purpose of confusing cameras and facial recognition technology. Apparently, anti-surveillance fashion is already a big thing in some parts of the world, so it's likely that the Lost Dog artist used one of those patterns in their piece, explaining why I can't get a good photo of the flyer. It didn't explain Eric's reaction, though. I fell asleep wondering if my friend was seeing something that I wasn't. For the next few days, more lost dog signs continued to appear around town, never in high-traffic areas or obvious places. I found one behind the bleachers at the community soccer field and another tucked behind a different flyer on a public bulletin board. Whoever this artist was, they were no Banksy. They seemed more keen to set up an Easter egg hunt than to make a bold public statement. On the following Saturday, while on a hike, I was surprised to find a "Found Dog" sign taped to a picnic table in a quiet clearing off of the main path. I was pleased at the sight. I was starting to think that the art project was meant to encourage the residents of our town to better appreciate their surroundings, and that my attention to detail was paying off as a result. Even more pleasing was the fact that this sign had a phone number to call on it. The sign had no picture, just the words, "Found Dog John," along with the number. Out of curiosity, I gave it a call. After 3 rings, someone picked up. I said nothing at first, wondering if I was about to speak to the artist themselves or simply hear some kind of pre-recorded message. After a moment, I heard a very strange voice. "Looking for a dog?" it said. There was some kind of heavy filter on the voice. It was staticky and guttural and seemed like it had been pitched down considerably. In a strange way, it reminded me of a large dog growling. "Yeah, I'm looking for John." "What's the word?" asked the voice. "The word?" I thought, looking over paper in front of me and trying to remember the exact phrasing of the Lost Dog flyer. Presumably, there was some kind of key phrase I had missed. "Shepherd," I guessed, and the person on the other end of the phone hung up. I tried calling back, but they didn't answer again. I put my phone away, disappointed, and took a seat atop the picnic bench. The sun was beginning to set, and a cool breeze had begun to sweep in from the north, whistling as it wound its way through the trees. I lowered my eyes from the pink and orange sky, staring into the tree line at the far end of the clearing. There was an animal peeking out through the brush. It was difficult to tell what exactly it was at such a distance, but it looked like a coyote, which my state has no shortage of. It was standing eerily still. I raised my hand slightly and waved at the creature as a joke to myself. And then the thing stood up on 2 legs. It wasn't an animal at all, I realized, but a person, clad head to toe in black and wearing a dog mask over their face. The person turned their back to me and walked deeper into the trees. Needless to say, that was not a comforting thing to witness. I left quickly after that, half jogging back to my car and glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. If I'd seen a person in a dog mask traipsing through the forest a week ago, I would have laughed. I would have assumed they were some kind of LARPer, rare as those might be in rural South Dakota. After my strange phone call, though, the sighting felt more ominous than funny. Was that the person I'd just been on call with? If so, had they seriously just been standing there waiting for someone to see their found dog flyer? The next day, as I visited my usual weekend haunts, I realized that the Lost Dog signs had been torn down. I guessed that the art project had reached its end, even though it seemed like a remarkably short run. I was disappointed that nothing more had come of it and that I would never get answers regarding who was behind the flyers. But I probably would have moved on with my life and forgotten all about it if it weren't for the visitor I received that night. It was around midnight. I was at my computer, playing video games and trying not to think about work in the morning when I got a text from Eric. Oddly enough, he asked if he could come over, and it was such an uncharacteristic request that I figured there was something wrong. I said yes, and he showed up at my door 20 minutes later. He looked a wreck. His hair was disheveled, his eyes were red, and his whole demeanor was nervous and fidgety. When he walked into my house, he held his phone in one hand and a rolled-up piece of paper in the other. "You're not going to believe me, man. You're going to think I'm going crazy," he said after declining both my offers for a glass of water and for a seat on my couch. I assured him that he could trust me, that I would take his words seriously. After a moment, he unrolled the piece of paper in his hand to reveal one of the lost dog flyers. "This is me," he said. I was taken aback. "What? You made the signs?" "No." He tapped on the picture in the center of the flyer. "This is a photo of me." I looked back and forth between his face and the flyer. I squinted, I unfocused my eyes, I looked at the photo from different angles. No matter what I did, the dog in question didn't resemble a human being in the slightest, much less the familiar face of my friend. I gave what was probably a very awkward laugh. "Okay, man, you got me. Very funny." Instead of breaking character and laughing along with me, Eric unlocked his phone and opened Instagram. Once in the app, he navigated to his profile and clicked on his most recent post, which was a selfie from last year. He held up his phone next to the flyer. "It's hard to tell, but I swear to God this is me. It's my last photo with a filter on it to break it down into shapes. You see this white part, the circle and the rectangle under it? That's my face and neck. And these dots, the little blue ones here and here, those are eyes. And the brown part up here is hair. I swear, I thought I was losing it, but everything lines up." I took the flyer and phone from his hands and tried to line up the shapes. It might have been the power of suggestion, but the more I looked between them, the more I started to see a match. "Also," he continued, "since you showed me this flyer, I've been hearing all sorts of weird shit. Outside my house at night, I keep hearing sounds like, I don't know, an animal or something. I thought a family of raccoons moved in, but it just doesn't sound like raccoons." "Have you checked for tracks?" "Yeah, but you know we've got a grass lawn right up to the porch. I see indents, but it's not like I can see marks." Eric shook his head. "Last night, I could have sworn I heard people talking, but I couldn't tell you a thing that was said. Maybe these flyers have me paranoid." I thought about the person I'd seen on my hike. Whether or not it was really an altered photo of Eric in the flyers, there was undoubtedly something strange going on in our town. I was quickly starting to regret wishing for some more excitement. "Tell you what," I said, "I've got some extra trail cams. How about tomorrow morning on my way to work, I stop by you and set some up? I'd like to get to the bottom of this as well." Eric accepted my offer and left my house a little calmer than he'd entered it. Just for the hell of it, before I went to sleep, I tried giving the number on the found dog flyer one more call. This time I got an intercept message telling me that the number had been disconnected or was no longer in service. The next morning, I went to Eric's house as planned. I rang the doorbell and waited. When he didn't answer, I tried knocking instead. Still no answer. I waited for a total of 10 minutes outside his front door, knocking and sending him a few texts. I didn't immediately panic, as my friend was notorious for sleeping in and showing up late to events. I left him a voicemail stating that I had to leave for work but would check in on him in the evening. It was only when I finished my workday and saw that my messages remained unread that I started to worry. I called his neighbor and asked her if she'd seen him, and when she said no, I asked her to do a wellness check of her own. Luckily, she had a spare key, and so I accompanied her to Eric's house. We didn't find Eric inside, nor did we find any signs of a struggle, but we found everything else: his keys, wallet, phone, even his shoes. It was that discovery that made me realize I had to get the authorities involved. Though I had never spoken to police before in all the years I'd lived there, I drove down to the station and reported my friend missing. It's been 3 years since Eric disappeared. In all this time, I haven't received any word from him, nor have the police been able to make any breakthroughs. I'm not sure if I should be happy or sad. On one hand, I'm grateful for the ambiguity. Who knows? Maybe Eric eloped to the Bahamas with a gorgeous woman and is happily living out his days by the shore as we speak. On the other hand, the events leading up to his disappearance seem to point to something more sinister. Eric is a good friend of mine, and a good man besides. And I pray that wherever he is now, that he's all right. The years have gone by in a blink. This town has always been oppressively unexciting, even more so now that the one guy who could kick my ass in billiards has dropped off the face of the earth. Not much changes in my static little world, but when something new emerges from the monotony, I take notice, as in the case of the sign I saw last night. It was early in the morning, and I was taking the old forest road back into town from a friend's party. Same emptiness. Same stretch of road. It might have been the exact same elm, too. In any case, as I drove in silence, a lost dog sign caught my eye. Posted against a tree at the edge of the road, it read, "John Shepherd, mix white coat, brown hood, brown eyes, $10,000. Beneath the text was a photo. Though abstract and blocky, I couldn't help but note a striking similarity between it and the last photo of myself I'd posted online. Just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, this next story will change your mind. For the past few months, my department has been gathering evidence and witnesses for the creator of a new drug that has appeared on the streets. It's small in scale, and we had hoped to nip it in the bud before it spiraled out of control. Ruby milk comes in syringe needles and is bright red, as the name suggests. The main problem with this narcotic is the side effects. The few addicts that have spoken to us and are coherent describe a high thermoth, the likes of which you've never experienced in your life. A rush of euphoria and complete tranquility washes over you. It makes you want to have more, but therein lies the problem. If you are exposed to doses higher than 1 milliliters, your body begins to decay around the injection site rapidly. I'm sure most have heard of the Russian street drug crocodile, imagine that, but amplified 100 times. We've come across decayed bodies in alleyways and under bridges, and all of them have a needle full of ruby milk not far away from their dead bodies. The worst ones are the ones we find that are still alive. I remember the first time I encountered an addict, and an entire chunk of her neck was just gone. Pus was leaking out from her neck, and she didn't seem to care at all. It only got worse from there, and soon this task force was formed to search for and find the source of ruby milk. My partner Susan and I were assigned to the task force as detectives. We knew the streets well. I grew up on them, and Susan's sister was unfortunately an addict who lived on them. Her sister, Marie, was one of our informants. Being a meth head, she was lucky to have the scoop on plenty of her fellow addicts. Marie thinks she has something. Susan told me as she looked over at me as I had just sat down to drink my 6-day-old coffee. I looked over at her and winced at the bitter and crappy taste. She hung up her desk phone and stood up to get her jacket. She wants to meet her at that abandoned house on 9th Avenue. "You couldn't have told me before I sat down?" I groaned as I placed down my coffee and stood to grab my jacket. "You're driving." I pointed at her and tossed the keys to our car at her. She caught them and flipped me off as I followed after her. Our city isn't the worst in the country, but it has its seedy parts. Pulling the car up to 9th Avenue, I scanned around at the row of abandoned houses that line the neighborhood. "So, which exactly is she in?" I looked over at Susan as she parked the car in front of one of the houses. She flicked her head over toward the house we were parked in front of. Unbuckling her seatbelt and leaving the car, I could tell that she was apprehensive about seeing her sister. I would too if my sister was in the state that Marie was in. She better be here. Susan sighed as she waited for me to exit the car. I closed the door and stared at Susan. She was a bitch most of the time, but it's what I enjoyed about her. She was confident in herself, and I admired that about her. But now here she was, nervous and just a little bit afraid. "Chin up, Susie." I smirked as she turned and punched me in the arm as hard as she could. If there's one thing in the world she hates, it's being called Susie. As I nursed my possibly broken arm, I followed after Susan as she walked up to the decrepit house. She knocked on the door and quickly backed up. As I rubbed my arm, I looked at her a little confused as to why she backed up so quickly. My confusion was quickly vanquished when the door flew open and a baseball bat was swung in the direction of where Susan had been. "Get the fuck away from..." "Oh, hi, Susie." Marie went from wanting to kill someone who had dared to trespass on her property to excited to see her sister. I could tell that they were related by the simple fact of how similar they looked. They weren't twins, but they'd been confused for twins in the past. Even being a meth addict, Marie was almost the spitting image of Susan. "Do you want to get punched too?" Susan asked as she raised her fist toward Marie and then gestured toward me. I walked over to her and pulled out my notepad. All right, what did you call me over here for, Marie? Do you have the info I asked for? Marie quickly nodded and placed her bat against the doorframe. Yay! One of my dealers tried selling me that red milk shit. I said I wasn't interested, and he said that if I was, I should go to this address. She quickly started patting her pockets to see where she had left the note she'd been given. Shit, where is it? 1 sec. She quickly walked back into the house and left us standing in the autumn wind. Can we trust her? I know she's your sister, but she isn't exactly the most reliable witness. I turned to look at Susan. She was standing and tapping her foot against the pavement and tapping her finger against her arm. Seeing her sister in this state was bothering her. I think we can. She's been doing better lately, and at the very least, she isn't using ruby milk. Susan sighed, perking up when her sister came running out of her abandoned house with a sticky note. Found it, she said happily, handing the note to her sister and smiling. Susan took the note and read it. Her eyes went wide and she looked back up at her sister. She handed me the note. I took it and looked down at it, and my own eyes went wide. Are you sure, Marie? This place is in a nice neighborhood. Are you sure your dealer told you the correct place? I wrote down the address on my notepad while I let Susan question her sister. Marie nodded quickly and stuck her hands in her pockets. That's the place. I trust Freddie. He's never given me shit product before. High praise coming from a meth addict. Susan looked over at me and sighed. It was going to be a risk, but it was one we were going to have to take since it was our only lead to the source of where ruby milk was coming from. Susan reached into her pocket and pulled out a wad of bills, walking over and placing the cash in her sister's hand. This is for groceries only. You understand me? I find out you bought more meth, and I'm cutting you off. Understand? Marie looked down at the money in her hand and quickly wrapped her arms around her sister and gave her a tight hug. One which Susan gave back to her. It was a touching moment between sisters, while I just stood there kicking rocks. Once we were back at the office, we quickly ordered a stakeout of the house in question. It was in a gated community, and we had to jump through plenty of hoops just to even be allowed inside the community. We set up a plumber van on the street that the house was on, and several days went by where not a living soul left the house. We were beginning to think that maybe Marie had indeed fed us fake information, or that Freddie had just been fucking with her. Susan and I were in the van on the last day of the stakeout. Our permit from the community was set to expire at the end of the day, and we were hoping and praying that something would happen on this day. Susan, we got something. I nudged her awake. She snorted and nearly punched me in the face before I quickly pointed at the house. She turned her gaze toward the house and quickly pulled her binoculars out. A few poorly dressed people suddenly exited from the house. They were quickly dragged back inside by someone unseen by the door. What the hell? We've been here for 6 hours. How did we not see anybody go in there? Susan asked as she lowered her binos. I wondered how we might have missed someone entering the house, when I suddenly remembered something about this gated community. Isn't this backyard connected to the forest preserve? I asked, quickly pulling out my phone to check. I pulled up maps and was quickly confirmed in my suspicion. This house's backyard was connected to the forest preserve, and not far away from this house was the parking lot for the forest preserve. We sent a squad car to examine the forest preserve's parking lot, and my hunch was proven correct. Several ruby milk addicts were found milling around the parking lot. It was flimsy evidence at best, but it was just enough to get a judge to sign a search warrant. Soon our task force was granted a SWAT team, and were we given the green light to raid the house. The name of the operation was called Operation Milkman, which I came up with, and which Susan hated. We made our way back to the gated community, and Susan took great pleasure in showing our warrant to the security guard who had made us jump through so many hoops to be able to set up surveillance here in the first place. We surrounded the house, and we made our way towards the front door. I knocked on the door and took a step back. Both me and Susan were wearing bulletproof vests and had our pistols drawn. We waited a few more seconds before banging on the door again. Police department, open the door, or we're breaking it down," I ordered. And when still no one answered, I motioned for the SWAT team to take the lead. The officer with the battering ram reduced the door to splinters in mere moments, and soon we had gained access to the house. I immediately wished that we hadn't. The moment we set foot in the house, the smell of death and decay hit our noses like an out-of-control semi-truck. Susan and I have pretty strong stomachs, but even we were almost brought down to our knees by the stench. A couple of the SWAT guys spit out vomit from their mouths, but kept moving through the house. It seemed like every couple of steps there was a decaying body laid out on the floor. Jesus Christ. Susan coughed out as she walked around the bodies laid out across the floor. I followed after her and the SWAT team as they went room to room trying to find any sign of life. We had almost given up hope when all of a sudden from one of the upstairs rooms we heard one of the SWAT members shout, "Hands up, motherfucker!" We quickly rushed towards the sound of the shouts, and soon we came across a room that was filled with beakers, burners, and so many prescription bottles that I thought for a moment we had busted a pharmacy robbery. "Let me see your hand!" The SWAT team screamed again. I followed where their rifles were trained and saw that there was indeed someone still alive, sitting at a table and looking at us. He was dressed in a hoodie with a face mask on. His eyes looked milky and hollow, and his hair was in an absolute mess. He slowly raised his hands and let out an annoyed sigh from behind his mask. His hands were covered in surgical gloves. The SWAT quickly closed the distance between them and grabbed him. They threw him to the ground and quickly slapped the cuffs on him. "What the fuck?" one of them said. Susan quickly walked over and then motioned me to come over as well. As they had lifted his hoodie sleeved up to properly get the cuffs on him, they discovered that his arms were completely stripped of flesh. They pulled the gloves off of him, and even his hands were completely bone as well. "All right, asshole, what the fuck is this?" Susan asked him, grabbing him by the hair and yanking his head up from off the floor. As she did so, we heard what sounded like a golf ball hitting the floor. It turned out to be one of this guy's eyes. It was a glass eye. "Man, I'm just getting all kinds of exposed today, aren't I?" He chuckled before Susan let his head go and allowed it to slam back against the floor. The SWAT members picked him off the floor, and I put on my pair of gloves and picked up his glass eye off the floor. We tossed him into our squad car and waited for the forensic team to arrive. These guys have some of the toughest stomachs I've ever seen, and even some of them were vomiting and gagging as they entered the house. We transported the prisoner back to the station and started the booking process, which was a problem as we couldn't get fingerprints from him for obvious reasons. And when we pulled down his face mask to get his mugshot, we were greeted with the fact that his entire lower face had also been peeled free of skin. The only bit of information we got from him was from his wallet. His name was Spencer Blackwell. He had no criminal history to speak of, and the only record we, or even the FBI, had on him was that he had been listed as a missing person before the case was dismissed. We had him cuffed to the table of the interrogation room with zip ties because he didn't have handcuffs that could keep him safely attached to the table. We had paramedics come to check him out since for all intents and purposes, he shouldn't have even been alive at that moment. All his vitals came back normal. One of the EMTs told us as he exited the interrogation room. We could barely figure out how to take his pulse, but it's normal. Temperature is normal. He's aware and cognitive. Honestly, he's healthier than most people I know. The EMT shrugged and joined us in looking at Spencer through the two-way mirror. He doesn't look normal and healthy. I crossed my arms and stared at him. Another thing that they had discovered was that both of Spencer's eyes were made of glass, and yet he could see perfectly fine. He had no tongue in his mouth, but he could speak just fine. He was perfectly normal, except for the simple fact that so much of him was exposed bone. Well, he's our best guess for the creator of Ruby Milk. We found thousands of doses in that little lab of his. And he was previously a chemical engineering student. He fits everything we know about the creator. Let's go and get some answers out of him. Susan tapped me on the shoulder, and I followed after her. As she opened the door to the interrogation room and entered it. So who's good cop, bad cop? You look pretty mean. Spencer pointed his bone fingers toward Susan. He wasn't wrong, as Susan sat down and slammed the manila envelopes she was carrying with her. I sat next to her with my cup of coffee and settled in for the show that was about to happen. "Don't I get a phone call first?" Spencer asked us. Susan ignored him before reading him his Miranda rights. "Knowing and understanding your rights as I have explained them to you, are you willing to answer my questions without an attorney present?" she asked, staring at Spencer and waiting for his response. The bone man simply shrugged in response. "Sure, I don't mind talking to you guys. It won't do you a lot of good, though." He let out a dry laugh and tried to lean back in his chair, only to be stopped by the zip ties holding him in place. He let out an annoyed grunt and pushed his chair up closer to the table. "So, what do you want to know? Are you the creator of Ruby Milk?" I asked first, beating Susan to the punch. I could already tell that she was going to have a tough time dealing with Spencer. She gets angry easily, and Spencer probably picked up on this. "Sure am," he said with pride in his voice. I bet if he still had skin on his lower face, he'd be smiling the widest grin. Well, in a way, he had a permanent smile on his face now. "You guys caught me in the middle of making a new batch. I just got those new ingredients, too." Spencer sighed, doing his best to lean back in his chair. "How'd you get all those ingredients? I doubt that you just walked into a pharmacy and asked for them." Susan pulled out another file and slid it across the table toward Spencer. It was several pictures of all the medical supplies and scores of prescription bottles. "Oh, that's easy. When dealers come to me for products, I send them to pharmacies to pick up these prescriptions. It's pretty easy in this day and age to face a prescription." He tugged against the zip ties and sighed in annoyance. "Look, I'm not going to attack you guys. Can you please cut these stupid things off? You do that, and I'll tell you everything you want to know." I looked over at Susan, and she nodded. I walked over and took out my pocket knife, cutting the ties off. "How did you create Ruby Milk?" she asked him. He was rubbing his wrists, which I thought was interesting since I figured that he couldn't possibly have felt anything, one of those things without nerves to feel them. "I doubt you want to hear a chemistry lesson from me, detective." Spencer sat back in his chair and stuck his hands in his pockets. Even though I knew he had been frisked and everything on his person had been confiscated, that still put me a little on edge. I came up with it after I left college. It took a lot of trial and error, but at least I had a good test subject, he said, with a dry laugh. "You tested on yourself?" I asked him, and he gave me a nod. "You don't start looking like this if you aren't prepared to make some sacrifices." In the end, I created Ruby Milk because I was bored. And hey, if I make something when I'm bored and other people enjoy it, shouldn't I be allowed to profit off of it? He asked so nonchalantly that it even made me angry at him. "Your product fucking kills people," Susan shouted, slamming her fist on the table and tossing another series of photos of him. It was of just a few of the bodies that had been discovered in his house. He looked down at them and picked up a couple of them. "Any drug that isn't used responsibly kills people. I told people the safe levels to inject themselves with. Am I to blame when they don't listen to me?" He tossed the photos back on the table and stared at the two of us with his hollow, unfeeling eyes. "You don't feel any remorse for these people?" I asked him. He looked me straight in the eyes and shook his head at me. I looked over at Susan, and she looked back down at her files in disgust. Spencer just sat there with his arms crossed at us, turning his head to look at the clock on the wall. Just as we were about to ask him more questions, the door to the interrogation room flew open, and our chief walked in. He looked over at Spencer and quickly walked over to us. "You two, come with me," he ordered. We looked at each other and stood up from our seats, gathering our files and following after our chief, leaving Spencer alone in the interrogation room. "What's the problem, Chief?" I asked him as he led us away from the interrogation room. He turned to look at us and rubbed his head wearily. I could tell that something bad was about to happen. "We have to let him go," the chief said. I stood there in shock and disbelief. Susan, in her usual manner, was much more verbal than I was. "The fuck you mean let him go?" she shouted, slapping the files against the wall in anger and pointing a finger at the chief. Why the fuck should we let that scumbag go? He's the source of ruby milk, and if we let him go now, he's going to hurt a lot more people, Chief. She scrambled, causing a scene in the hallway. Susan, did you look at the warrant you got? It was filled out incorrectly. Not only that, but we also know you got the information from your drug addict sister. I thought I made it clear that I wouldn't tolerate you using her as an informer anymore. The chief told us to prove our point. He handed us a copy of the warrant. I took it before Susan could rip it to shreds in her anger. I scanned the warrant everywhere, trying to see where the mistake had been made. And I felt my heart sink when I saw what the mistake was. We had written down the wrong address for the house. I handed the paper over to Susan. She took one look at it and also immediately knew what was wrong with it. That's not possible. How could we mess this up? She said in disbelief, shaking her head over and over again. You can't be serious, Chief. You can't be, she pleaded, but he held his hand up to her and nodded. I'm afraid I am. Let him go, you two. I'm sorry it has to be this way. He sighed and turned to walk away from us. Susan stared at me for a moment before hanging her head in defeat. We made our way back to the interrogation room and found Spencer pacing around in the room. You're free to go, I told him, barely able to get the words out. He looked at us and I could just feel the shit-eating grin he must have been trying to give us. We followed after him as he collected his confiscated items. He placed his face mask back on and his gloves. Just before he left the station, he turned to look at us. You know something. You look familiar. He pointed at Susan. He pulled down his mask as if it was going to give him a better view of her. You look like one of my regulars. In fact, she showed up today, asking to sample some ruby milk. Maybe I'm mistaken. He waved goodbye to us and left us alone at the entrance. I stared at Susan as the gears in her head suddenly clicked. Oh God, no, she quickly shouted, reaching into her pocket and pulling her phone out. I followed after her once she started running toward the car we shared. She quickly threw the car in drive and drove with her light blaring towards 9th Avenue, trying to call Marie the whole time. Once we arrived, Susan leapt out of the car so quickly that she almost forgot to park the damn car. She ran up to the door and quickly began smashing her fists against the door. Marie, open the fucking door, she screamed, throwing her shoulder against the door. I quickly ran after her and added my own weight to the door. It came down soon afterward and we both entered the house. Marie! Susan screamed as she started searching for her sister. I followed after, looking everywhere for her. I entered the kitchen and soon found Marie. She was sitting at the kitchen table with half her face melting away. She turned to look at me with a dazed look on her face. Oh, hey, she said. Susan came running into the kitchen upon hearing her voice and let out a pained wail upon seeing her sister. Marie's head cocked to the side and a large chunk of her skin fell to the floor in a sick wet plop as she did so. Hey, Susie, I feel sleepy, she mumbled before going limp in her chair. Susan wailed louder and ran to her sister, grabbing her and shaking her. She immediately laid her on the floor and started doing CPR as I quickly phoned for an ambulance. As I was stepping outside to call for the ambulance, a loud crack went off, and I suddenly found myself lying on the floor and unable to move. He tried to speak and only managed to spit out a large amount of blood. I'd been shot. Fancy meeting you here, Detective. Spencer's voice came upon me and he moved my limp head to look up at me. He pulled his face mask back down to look at me and I noticed the revolver he had in his hand. Just had to teach you two a lesson about fucking with me. He patted me on the head and let my head droop back down. I heard him walk into the house and I heard 2 more shots ring out. I tried desperately to move. Soon I heard footsteps approaching and Spencer grabbed my head again to look up at me. Not to worry. I feel like leaving you as a vegetable is better. I reunited the 2 sisters though. I'm not a cruel person after all. He laughed, letting my head drop back to the floor before he kicked me in the head as hard as he could. Paramedics found me several minutes later. They found Susan cradling her dead sister with 2 shots to the back of her head. I was in the hospital for a long time and managed to regain use of my upper body. The shot had shattered my spine, and I was lucky to not have been killed outright. But to add insult to my injuries, I was fired from the force. I decided to come here to get some kind of justice for my partner, and maybe also just to get the story out there. Since that day, I haven't heard a thing about Ruby Milk in the news, and none of my former colleagues will speak to me about it. So maybe there's somebody out there that will listen to my story. If even one person reads this and learns about this, please do everything in your power to stop Spencer Blackwell. If you think that was horrifying, what's coming up might just haunt your dreams. I'm a rookie with the Winchester Police Department, Supernatural's division. Funnily enough, I never believed in the supernatural up until a couple months ago. Hell, part of me still doesn't believe in it, even with the things I've seen. For example, just this past week, the division detained its first mermaid. Siren. The two entities absolutely loathe being mistaken for the other. I'm still new to the job, and I'm in the process of learning to disregard everything the media has told me. So if any elders are reading this, I truly meant no disrespect. For those of you that aren't aware of who elders are, well, they're elder. Beings that inhabited the earth way before we came along. Some places around the world have different names for them. Fae, Sidi, Neighbors, Diwata, Yosei, Dokaibi. Around these parts of Winchester, Michigan, though, we call them elders. The very first thing I was taught is that long ago, us humans pushed them out of the lands they once ruled, so the least we can do is be respectful towards them. Thankfully, I've yet to encounter a real nasty elder. I hear things can get pretty ugly if you upset one well enough. These beings can be quite powerful, seeing as elders can harness and tap into an ethereal energy that is invisible and mostly inaccessible to us. Magic. No, I'm not shitting you. Magic is real. Elders are also very clever and can look like anyone or anything whenever they want. You never know when you might unsuspectingly engage in a conversation with someone that is eons older than they look. So, as a reminder, respect everyone, especially your elders. Getting back to our latest catch, pun intended, she was a real pain in the ass to track down. It's not often you come across a freshwater siren. They're more difficult to deal with, seeing as they can go from one body of water to another. Sure, the oceans are big, but in the event a siren comes ashore to feed, they tend not to stray far from the salty sea. It's a completely different beast, when your suspect can travel pretty much anywhere on land, as long as there's a fresh water source nearby. Our lieutenant personally requested that Detective Dustin Davidson, my partner, and I bring our fish friend in after a news segment about local missing men aired. The only thing left of them were their empty wallets, which had been found either by a creek, river, or in one instance, a pool. In the segment, the reporter also interviewed an old man who claimed to be a victim that survived his brush with the party responsible. There was a large bandage on his cheek, and he had a pretty bad black eye. He definitely survived something, all right. The next 2 minutes of the broadcast consisted of a detailed rant about him encountering a luscious-looking she-devil with claws, razor-sharp teeth, and a glimmering green fishtail in a pond while on his evening hike at a local trail. Poor guy had accidentally stumbled upon a feeding session. Sirens are known to be territorial and very protective of their feeding grounds, kinda like resource guarding with dogs. Seeing him as a threat, the she-devil lunged out of the water and attacked him, screeching out a horrible song as she did. He only got away because her prey in the water was still alive and started trying to run. The siren wanted her meal more, so she hissed at him, then slithered back into the water to finish what she started. When he went back the next day, the only evidence he found that proved something had happened was a man's empty wallet sitting by the edge of the pond. Our survivor reported the incident to the authorities, but our counterparts didn't believe him and called the guy a crackhead. Those lazy fuckers didn't even bother to file a report. If they had, the case would have been flagged and sent directly to our division, where we could start an investigation immediately. But, because this didn't happen, and we found out from the news, Lieutenant Dawn was pretty pissed. A guy ranting about lunatic mermaids on TV wasn't exactly a good look for us. You see, civilians and the other half of Winchester PD don't know that our division exists. The division's purpose is to bring in supernatural perpetrators that make a lot of noise. We want to keep the general public from getting suspicious about the things that go bump in the night being real. The expression, ignorance is bliss, is an expression for a reason. Anyway, the news crew probably included that interview as an attention-getter to the case, dismissing his testimony altogether and deeming him insane. But to us in the know, he gave us valuable information and a great tip. Now we knew what creature to look for. The fishtail and horrid singing were telltale signs of a siren. Davidson rookie, Lieutenant Dawn addressed Dustin and I after the segment ended. Track down our witness and get a proper statement. Then get a profile on our siren. We need to bring her in before she causes us even more trouble. The last thing we need are some siren hunters snooping around. Yes, sir. Dustin and I nodded in unison, graciously accepting the assignment. It had been a slow day, and we were eager to catch some action. Not even 20 minutes later, we were leaving to speak with our witness, Polly Rutledge. Dustin grabbed his coat off his office chair, then shot me a devious grin as he put it on. Ready to go, rookie? With a huff and roll of my eyes, I grabbed the rest of my things and walked off. I hate being called rookie. It's so stupid because that's what I am, and he was just trying to be playful. But at my old department, it was used derogatorily and wasn't a good thing to be called. Plus, being called a rookie brings up bad memories. My therapist says I should try to reclaim the word, and I'm trying my best to. But as of now, you can call me Lucky. She also said it might help me process my trauma a little better if I kept a diary. So think of this as a 2-for-1 special. I get to vent to the internet and make my job a little easier by giving life-saving advice on any supernaturals that might cross your path. Officer Hale, Dawn stopped me on my way out of the precinct, whispering in my ear, "Prove them wrong. Show me you're a good cop. Show me why I recruited you." My body went rigid. "Yes, sir." I barely managed to stumble out. He pat my shoulder firmly and shot me a reassuring smile. Dawn left as soon as Dustin caught up with me. The two of us then left the precinct without saying much about the encounter. I could see he wanted to pry, but left it alone instead. I appreciated that. When we interviewed Mr. Rutledge, he said the same thing as before. Paulie was on his evening stroll on a local trail when he heard a woman's hums and intense splashing coming from the pond. Concerned, he went off trail to see if he could help. That's when he spotted the siren, and she attacked him. The good news is he was able to give us a better description, other than the one on the news. Right before she jumped out of the water and revealed her true terrifying siren features, Polly said the woman had pale skin, long curly black hair, hypnotic blue eyes, and a tattoo of an anchor right above her right collarbone. Armed with that new description, Dustin and I got ready to leave. But before we could, Polly asked if we believed him, since we were there following up on his account. He looked at us with a glimmer in his eye, happy that somebody was finally listening to him. Dustin straight up told him no, said we were doing a mandatory routine follow-up, and if he was being honest with himself, the visit had been a complete waste of everyone's time. All the while, I stood behind Dustin with my lips pressed shut. Our parting words with the man were to stay off the drugs, or the next time we came back, it wouldn't be pretty. The last thing I saw as the front door closed were Polly's soul-crushed eyes on the brink of tears. Needed to take a breather after that. I had almost bitten my tongue off back there. "It's all part of the job," Dustin reminded me, gripping the steering wheel of his brown '78 Corolla liftback, staring blankly into the distance. "It sucks, but it's a necessary evil." Clearly it had affected him too, judging by how white his knuckles were. Pulling out into the street, he turned the dial on his radio, and an old rock song came on. Dustin happily hummed along as we drove, energetically tapping on the steering wheel along to the beat. It was almost uncanny the way he could switch from his usual happy-go-lucky self to bitterly ice-cold in an instant. It freaked me out, but being duly personable and serious are good qualities to have in a detective. Back at the precinct, we started putting a case file together. Here's what we knew about our siren. She was young and beautiful looking. All sirens are. She had long curly black hair and a distinctive tattoo of an anchor on her collarbone. And for some reason, this one really liked snacking on unfaithful men. That's what our profiler, Jane, said anyway. She gathered all that after sifting through the files we pulled on the missing men, friend and loved one testimonies weren't worth shit, unfortunately. Jane only figured out the siren's type after hacking into one of our bachelor's phone records. And before anyone says anything, since we're an unknown legal entity, the Supernaturals division is like the Wild West out here. Pretty much anything goes, including magically aided hacking. Did I mention Jane was a witch? Text messages between our bachelor and his friends revealed that our siren had matched with him on a dating site. The kicker? He had a girlfriend he was about to propose to. This guy wanted one last hurrah before tying the knot. Yeah, according to him, the siren's profile said she was a singer. And judging by some provocative messages I will not be providing here, a bombshell with a great personality. Our bachelor and the siren talked for a few hours before she proposed they met up, an offer which Mr. Horndog readily obliged. Before the pair met up, though, he told his friend all about the woman he was about to meet up with. And of course, said friend didn't want to say anything when the report was filed, because as he put it in one of his texts, bros before hoes. After Jane cross-referenced the other victims' records with Bachelor 1's, she proved her hunch right. All the men that had gone missing were rich players looking to cheat on their partners. With a description, hunting ground, and an ideal victim profile, we were ready to get to work. The plan to catch our siren was simple. We were going to set up a honey trap. Being bait was out of the question for me. I'm single and have boobs. That meant Dustin would be our lure, a role he was fine with undertaking. It didn't take long for the siren to match with Dustin's fake profile. After all, we knew what likes of hers to cater to. After an impromptu photo shoot, we had some good-looking photos of Dustin looking wealthy with his hands posed, showing a wedding band on his finger. Audra was the alias she was going by this time around. The siren's MO was matching with her victim on whatever dating app, chatting and building a good rapport with them, then luring her prey out somewhere that was near the water, never to be seen again. Once she was full and had taken all his cash, she'd unmatch with the poor sap and delete her profile before starting the cycle all over again a couple days later with a new name. This is why it was a top priority to bring Audra in. If she was out killing men every couple of days, it was purely for sport. Sirens typically only hunt when it's absolutely necessary. We knew we'd found our siren based off her profile pictures. Audra was stunning and could pass for a model. She glowed in every picture. The photo that gave us the positive ID was one of her at the beach in a red bikini. The Great Lake behind her sparkled, basking her in a glow that made her shine like a goddess. Peeking just behind her top strap was a little ship anchor. Dustin sent the first message. It was a corny pickup line. Audra sent back a quippy response asking him if that line ever worked. He asked if it did on her. She replied yes, she's the one that suggested they meet up. Dustin entertained the idea but played hard to get. He brought up having plans later that he just couldn't miss, alluding to his fake wife. That was a good move on his part because after that, Audra got really interested in going out with him. Dustin led her on for a bit before finally accepting the invitation. We let her pick the location. A bar that was a quick 5-minute walk away from Winchester Beach on the shore of Lake Erie. She wanted to meet him there at 8 p.m. Sirens are like sharks and do their hunting at night. Of course, he wasn't going to meet up with Audra alone. I was going to follow them wherever they went. Dustin's job was to get her to a secure spot on the beach where I'd set up shop with a high-frequency sonar gun and a spotlight to stun her long enough for him to cuff her. Just like they use sound to hurt us, sound can be used to hurt sirens if the decibel is right. And because their eyes are extremely sensitive in the dark, a strong, bright flash of light can temporarily blind them, buying valuable time. But no matter what, we couldn't let her get into the water. Sirens are shifters, and they're pretty hard to take down as it is while on land. We'd die before getting the chance to bring her in if she were at full strength in her natural habitat, where she was at the top of the food chain. Dustin left for the bar first, with me carefully tailing behind him. He'd slicked his auburn hair back with some gel and was wearing his classy business attire. Detective Davidson definitely looked like a rich asshole, albeit a handsome rich asshole. Audra seemed to buy the charade. When they met at the bar, she lit up like a firework, ogling over him and tracing her fingers on his skin seductively. Those pictures didn't do her any justice. She looked even more beautiful in person. Her hair was pinned up into a perfect messy bun, and she wore an expensive long white dress with red flowers all over. A scandalous slit revealed everything below the top of her thigh. I spied on the two of them from the passenger seat of my car as they laughed and drank with each other. Dustin was careful to sip his drinks sparingly, but played a very convincing drunk. He set the plan in motion after his second drink, sending me a text letting me know they were about to be on the move. I pulled out of my parking spot and drove down the road, closer to the beach. I had a better vantage point there, with a good view of the bar and the walkway down to the water. A couple minutes later, I had eyes on Dustin and Audra as they came stumbling out of the bar. I got worried when she abruptly dragged him into a corner store by the bar. I was about ready to hop out, guns blazing, when they finally re-emerged with a white grocery bag and a bottle of booze. She was trying to get him as inebriated as possible. Less of a fight that way. Back out in the open, Dustin looked just as relieved as I did. The pair made their way over to the walkway that led to the beach, laughing and holding hands. In another life, Dustin could have been an actor with how well he was pulling off this performance. Discreetly, I exited my vehicle, grabbed my equipment, and stalked along the tall grass towards our rendezvous point. My earplugs and noise-canceling headphones went on once I'd set up the spotlight. This was to prevent her song from influencing me or damaging my ears. I wish Dustin could have had some protection on him down there, but then he ran the risk of being compromised. Like a sniper, I trained my eye on Audra, ready to pull the trigger if she even looked like she would try to sing her song to Dustin. I watched as she slipped off her dress, revealing the same red bikini from the photo. She posed for Dustin before jumping up and down a couple of times while pointing at the water. She then grabbed his wrists, trying to pull him in with her. I tightened my grip on the trigger when he pulled back, digging his feet in the sand. He was trying to keep her from getting in the water. Audra looked displeased, her hands still on his wrists. "Something about this smells fishy," I mumbled under my breath. The look on Dustin's face made me uneasy. Audra's demeanor seemed to change as she spoke. It didn't look like she was singing, but whatever she was saying had irked him. Then, doing the dumbest thing in my career so far, I took off the headphones and earplugs. "I know you're out there. Come out. I want to see you," Audra yelled in a sing-song voice, stroking a sharp nail beneath Dustin's chin. Shit. He'd been made. I didn't reveal myself and kept quiet. Dustin did the same. After a moment, Audra broke the silence. "Fine, have it your way." She pursed her lips and started singing. The spotlight flashed faster than a bolt of lightning. Audra's song was interrupted by her pained screams as she shielded her eyes, giving me enough time to get down to the beach. Regaining herself, Audra screeched at Dustin. The shrill sound of her voice knocked him on his knees. A particularly sour note rang out, causing him to pass out. I took the sonar gun and shot a pulse at her. The first blast neutralized her song. Then the next one knocked her back away from the water. If she escaped, she'd have her pick of 5 Great Lakes that had access to 2 separate countries. Couldn't have that. Audra was so disoriented after the second pulse, she fell and hit her head on a rock. The next 3 rounds, I shot in rapid succession just for good measure. Panic gripped my chest as I went back to examine Dustin. He was unconscious, pale, and his nose and ears were bleeding. I couldn't go through this. Not again. I looked for anything that could be used to wake him up. My eyes spotted the white grocery bag from the corner store. Rifling through it, I found an ice-cold water bottle. "Get up," I yelled, dumping most of the contents on his face. I chucked the bottle behind me as my palm connected with his cheek. I said, "Get up." With a roaring start, Dustin came back to life. He sat up, taking deep, gasping breaths, rubbing his sore cheek. Relief flooded through me as I blinked tears away. "Are you okay?" Dustin gave me a short nod before the wind was knocked out of me. Something had tackled me from the side. My head bashed against the packed sand as the siren threw me to the ground. Audra had me pinned on my back, the full weight of her tail pressing down on my chest. She wrapped her clawed hands around my throat and started to squeeze. Her black, soulless eyes stared into mine as she licked her lips hungrily. How had she transformed? She was nowhere near the water. I managed to look to my side near where Audra had fallen earlier. Rolling around in the wind was an empty plastic bottle, the goddamned water bottle. How could I have been so stupid, made such a rookie mistake? I struggled to breathe as the siren started to crush my windpipe like it was nothing. Digging my nails into her face and wrists didn't seem to do anything. You smell delicious, Audra whispered in a hum as she licked the skin by my ear. She took a deep breath in, savoring my scent, causing chills to run down my spine. A choked gasp left my mouth as stars started to dot my vision. A tear slipped past my waterline. A clawed finger picked it up before it could disappear forever. Audra's finger made a popping sound around her lips as she lapped it up like a greedy puppy. She giggled, opening her mouth to eat my face off. Your tears taste just as powerful as... Squelch. Audra released her death grip on me as her breath hitched in her throat. I followed her eyes down to her shaking hands, which were covered in blood. Bulging out of her stomach was the end of a metallic projectile. She shifted back to human as her body went limp from the sheer amount of blood loss. I'm pretty sure I cracked a rib when the full weight of her body collapsed on top of me. Standing behind the passed-out siren was Dustin, with the other half of the weapon in his hand. The moonlight illuminated him, and it well. A harpoon? Where the hell did you get a harpoon? I asked incredulously, harshly shoving Audra off me in the process. Dustin stood there, panting heavily. He pointed to a lifeguard station behind him. Over there. Overcome with exhaustion and just grateful to be alive, I burst out laughing. After a minute, Dustin chuckled with me, lifting the limp siren's body off the ground. She let out a low moan as Dustin double-cuffed her and hauled her over his shoulder. He then stuck his hand out to help me up. Together we carried the siren back to his car. Albeit bruised and banged up from this sting, we got the siren back to the precinct with everyone mostly in one piece. She would receive medical attention and get that harpoon arrow removed. But after that, our friend Audra would be sent to a secure, soundproof cell where she will be spending the rest of her days. Moral of the story here? Sirens are gold diggers and don't trust pretty women that can sing. I'm pretty sure Taylor Swift is a siren tattoo, but nobody here has yet to give me confirmation. I'm still pretty shaken up by the whole thing, considering I almost died. Lieutenant Dawn ordered that I take a couple days off to rest for the rib and everything. My neck is still pretty stiff, bruised, and swollen. Every time I close my eyes and drift off to sleep, her face jump scares me, like a nightmare. My mind is trying to convince my body it was just that, a nightmare. But Audra, she was real. Her words were real too, and they are constantly echoing in the back of my mind. I go back tomorrow, though. Everyone is required to work the Halloween shift. It's the busiest day of the year for the division, so all hands are on deck. As the big day draws near, all the crazies are starting to come out. It's probably one of the reasons why Audra was acting like that, to be honest. The station has been stocking up on silver bullets, wooden stakes, cream, and other helpful little knickknacks for the past couple weeks. Our reserves are pretty good, so we shouldn't have too much trouble handling the supernaturals that head our way. It is All Hallows Eve, though, so something interesting is bound to come up. Do not fret. Depending on how the shift goes, I'll get a detailed report out sometime in the next couple of days. It'll be my first Halloween at WPD Supernaturals Division, and from what I can gather, it's going to be on hell of a shift. Think you've heard it all? This next story might make you wish you hadn't. Little Red Door. 5 5-year-olds not sleeping in cribs without adult supervision. That's how the hazy, terrifying orb began on Devil's Night in an after-school daycare of dubious quality. 5-year-olds do not normally sleep in cribs. They don't regularly nap after kindergarten. They want to constantly explore and play and run around and scream. Miss White, I think her name was, didn't like noise or children. But she did like money. And booze, I think. She didn't charge too much to imprison us for an hour until our parents could get off work and pick us up. I hated daycare. We all did. We hated Miss White too. She yelled really loud if we talked above a whisper. Climbing out of the cribs was also forbidden. I can't believe our parents left us there. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe they did and had no other choice. School let out at 3 in the afternoon. What full-time job ends at 3? We were stuck. The 5 of us basically stared at one another. John made funny faces once, and we all tried. That got us giggling. That's how we learned Miss White was a yeller. I'm not sure if the Devil's Night custom is anywhere else but Bridal Veil Lake and/or Ontario. So I'll explain. The day before Halloween and the evening before is referred to as Devil's Night. People, mostly teenagers, play pranks, throw eggs, toilet paper trees and houses, and generally get up to no good. That's the gist of it. Some people, including my parents, took it a little more seriously. Newspapers had reported cats being taken and killed for ritualistic purposes. Not sure if it was true, but I came to regard the day with greater apprehension. I didn't want either of my cats to die. I'm not sure if my fear caused what happened, but it and the day itself served to etch the incident into memory. The ticking of the ancient clock we couldn't read marked the eternal seconds. Silence and misery and fear. What if my parents didn't come on time? They always did. But what if a traffic jam happened and they couldn't get me until night? Devil's Night. Look, Mazan said. He stood up on his thin mattress, tall enough the railing stopped below his knees, and pointed to the painted concrete wall beneath the clock. A small red door had appeared. Trapped in this windowless room for months now, we knew the interior well. That door, shiny red, like an apple, had not been a part of it. What is it? Dixon asked. He wore an eye patch band-aid, I don't know why, and had trouble turning to see. It's a door, I said. Children point out the obvious honestly, and without consideration for what is plainly in front of others' eyes. Is it a real door? Allison, a redhead with severe freckles, asked. It's a real door, I confirmed without knowing anything about it. Shh, Arabella cautioned. She was the most scared of Miss White. She'd been on the receiving end, the spittle point, of the old woman's anger. She'll come in. We should open it, Dixon suggested. He didn't wait for a consensus. Children don't have that kind of patience. He climbed out of his crib and landed heavily on the rug, which absorbed much of the sound but released entombed dust. He sneezed immediately, and we stared in fear at the big door against the opposite wall. When it stayed shut and nothing but the babble of someone on TV continued, we all began our more careful descent. Don't land on the rug, I told everyone. I'm the leader. No one argued. A cold draft emitted from around the edges of the red door, which didn't seem to touch any part of the frame or have visible hinges at all. These details were unremarkable to a 5-year-old, but I remember the sight vividly. Listen, I said to the others. There's music. It was hard to hear, but true. It sounded like the electronic trill of a modern ice cream truck. We all knew that sound and began to get excited. I opened the little red door to another world, a dimly lit earthen floor and the cloying odors of ash and something foul we did not yet comprehend. The music continued. Despite the absence of any truck, we were sure it'd be ahead. I don't think we should go, Arabella said. With ice cream on the line, none of us listened. She followed at the back and fanned out onto a carpet of dead grass. It's gone, Arabella shrieked immediately. Look, look! We did, and didn't understand what she meant. Object permanence became part of our cognitive toolset before age 1. The belief in magic, however, would likely be around for at least another year. It's okay, I said. I'm the leader, and I say the door is gone, but it will come back when my parents come to get me. I did not know this as fact, but had experienced countless nonsensical explanations from adults. The point of the words wasn't to make sense, but to simply say a lot until everyone felt better, or the relevant issue had been forgotten. No one appeared to feel better in the midst of so many shadows. They moved like waves against aquarium glass, oily darkness pushing against the minuscule island, invisible against a starless sky. The ice cream music stopped. We sensed the ruse. It showed in our glum expressions. Be not afraid, a voice like vibrating static said from above and nowhere. It was not pleasant, and we cowered in a hugging pile in the grass. Who's there? I asked. Seconds of dreadful silence elapsed before an answer from that horrible voice. I am that I am, the counterpart to Mercy, the one who knows the value of humans. This band of 5-year-olds shared worried and befuddled expressions. Oh, I said, where's the ice cream? Dixon patted my shoulder and nodded. He approved of the question. I felt validated in nominating myself to lead, and then he dropped. Dead, instantly dead. His visible eye saw nothing. He had no apparent cause of death. The 4 remaining children started to cry. Excellent, the harsh voice concluded. You only knew Dixon from inside that woman's cell. Yet you shed tears for him. I did not expect such an impact. Truly, young humans are the veal of my kind. Again, its words were lost on us, but Dixon was dead. People that did bad things got in trouble. I'm going to tell on you, I said. My dad's a police officer. Muzan shouted toward the ceiling or sky. He stopped crouching and wiped away the tears from his cheeks. He's got a gun. He will shoot you. His defiant posture wilted under the sudden clearance above. A floating mask of tortured iron, barbed and burred, appeared as large as the island itself. Its eyes and nostrils and mouth contained a dark so dense it pulled the light from our eyes. We could not look at it for more than a few seconds, and we could not stop trying to see to understand what it was. We shivered and clutched at one another, becoming a writhing mass digging for the bottom, hoping one among us would become the human shield. There is no conscious form of life, it said, that does not extract its existence from another life. The cows do not know their meat. The bees think they make honey for themselves, and humans believe their purpose is a mystery, that they do not consistently make a product consumable by others. They are wrong. Somehow, I ended up on top of my friends. Dixon's dead eye searched for meaning. I couldn't express it that way then. I only knew his expression seemed sad. He wanted to know why. So did I. You're wrong, I challenged it. And Dixon's mom and dad will kill you when they come to pick him up. The other kids tugged me down. I let them. I guess we felt safer in a pile. Human memory isn't so fixed, it replied. The mouth did not move when it spoke, but heat, almost unbearable, came from nostrils obscured by a bird-like nose. Its image crudely resembled a human face. You do not know your grandfather's name, it went on, and if you age, you likely never will except through direct effort. If it is an interest of yours, and even then you're not likely to know your great-grandparents' names, and further back, it becomes more and more unlikely you will ever know who your ancestors were specifically. I can hasten this forgetting. Dixon's parents will forget they had a son. It talked so much, and it was scary. I hated its voice. I don't know what you mean, I shouted, angrily, on the verge of a nervous breakdown or a tantrum. The mask remained immutable. I will make you remember everything that happened here today, and as you grow, so too will your suffering, for that is the one consistent product of humanity. Pain. They give it. They cause it. Out of nothing, they conjure it, even when all is well in their lives. That's what it is to be a human. A crack of lightning struck the island. I didn't see a thing. When I opened my eyes, the rest were all dead, burnt and mutilated by whatever force the entity had conjured. I sobbed and begged for Mommy. The little red door appeared. My vision had been blurred by tears. I tripped and scrambled to find the handle, which turned out to be locked. I cried out some more, and it waited and fed off my anguish until no more could be extracted. Then it said, "Lo, when you are grown, you will become ripe for true suffering. Then you will see the door again and walk through it willingly." The handle turned in my straining hands, and I fell forward, tumbling down through realities and into my own body. "Wake up, little man," my father's voice. I turned into his arms. He labored to pick me up. "Whoa, been a while since I got you from a crib. Come on, got to get home before dark or we'll get egged." A dream. A nightmare. I might have been convinced if not for the 4 other empty cribs and the possessions of my friends left behind. Backpacks and water bottles. Enough familiar letters of Muzan's name in Sharpie on the top Velcro strip of his shoe. Arabella's cotton candy tiger stuffy. Strands of Allison's red hair hung from my still trembling fingers. Yet, no one ever mentioned them. When I did, it was attributed to the generally awful experience at the daycare. I did tell my parents about Miss White and the little red door, but it was all attributed to not wanting to return to the old lady's house. I never did, and after years and years of therapy and drugs and special programs, I came to believe what everyone told me. It never happened. Muzan, Allison, Arabella, Dixon were not real people. Something else, probably at the hands of Miss White, villainous daycare operator, had caused the convincing delusion. Yet the prophecy or the curse of the Iron Mask entity proved to be true. The older I got, the more suffering I caused and experienced. Only after I met my wife, Janet, did I begin to feel joy and hope again. And that was fairly late in life. 36, and we were married. 37, and we had our first child, a boy, Neil, after her dad. Sadly, the worry and anxiety I had over my son ruined much of the wonder and fulfillment commonly attached to raising a child. My memory of the little red door and what lived inside was too vivid. Oh God, what if it appeared outside Neil's crib someday? I became obsessed with Neil's safety. I quit my job to be with him. I would not let him go to school at age 4 or 5, especially 5. Janet grew worried too. Then she got scared. Then we divorced, and Neil stayed with her while I found a room in a basement apartment near the community college in Bridal Veil Lake. The red door, I begged her. Don't leave him alone. Please, she begged me, get help. And I tried, but nothing could penetrate the perfectly forged memory of the iron mask. I am that I am, and I truly believed that for a while, praying to it, pleading for relief. I'm 44 and it's Devil's Night. I just got off the phone with Janet a few hours ago. Neil wanted to paint the door to his room red. You didn't let him, I accused her. I did, she replied. I want him to know there's nothing to the delusion you've been feeding him. That hurt. I miss her. I love her. I suffer, and it feeds the beast. Don't leave him. I dropped my phone. The little red door, as shiny as ever, appeared next to my bed. A mattress on the floor. None of its edges, the door that is, touched the frame. It floated. It does not have hinges. The ice cream music played, but I could not be so easily deceived, and so it ceased to be replaced by a more familiar, far more devastating routine. Daddy? Daddy, my son. Neil, he is behind the door. I'm sickened to admit I didn't rush in. I wrote this first. A record, I guess, a warning, but to whom? 5-year-olds? They know not what they do, and they cannot be stopped. I go now to spare my son, or at least give him some time. If you thought you were safe, think again. The next tale is even more terrifying. Nobody writes about the grinning prince. The thing about urban legends is that while they are supposedly an oral tradition, people love writing about them online. You can pretty much trace the whole Polybius myth from one message board post to dozens of podcasts over the course of 25 years. Not the grinning prince, and not even the show, not really. Everyone who was a kid in the New York area in the 70s and 80s remembers this TV show. It was the most popular kids program on a local channel, the one that showed baseball. But somehow it never went to other markets, and even weirder, nobody in the area recorded it. By the time it went off the air in '84, plenty of people had VCRs, but no matter how much you search YouTube, you only find short clips of the garden full of psychedelic puppets being herded by singing hippies. You never see a full episode, so you never hear the roster. You also never hear the puppets say the one thing they absolutely said at least once in every episode: all things serve the grinning prince. The roster was the end of the show, when the hippies would put down their guitars and sing, a cappella and off-key, 4 names. For example, we see Jordan and Kyle and Carrie and Julie and you. Everyone remembers the roster, and everyone remembers the rules. At some point, an older sibling or a friend would warn you. When they said your name in the roster, you had to place the thing you loved the most on the ground in your yard, with a letter asking the prince for a gift. If you did, you would get your gift. If you didn't, first the grinning prince would warn you in your dreams that night. If you still disobeyed, the prince would visit your bed the next night. If you disobeyed again, nobody knew. Something bad. My name, the real one on my birth certificate, is uncommon. My nickname was and is marginally less weird, but still unpopular, so I never got called on the roster. My cousin Davey wasn't that lucky. He tried not to cry when I asked him where his Wayne Foundation playset was. He had just gotten it for Christmas, and I was incredibly jealous. If any of you collected Mego superheroes, you would understand. He solemnly explained that he ignored the prince when he dreamt of him. The next night, Davy woke up to a withered, 6-fingered hand rising up from the side of his bed, reaching for him. He spent the rest of the night in his parents' bedroom, screaming. In the morning, while his mom was doing laundry, he went in the yard and dug into the frozen ground. I was 4. He was 6. That conversation is my earliest, clearest memory. There is no reason why I should have cared so much about finding this show as an adult, but I am stubborn and nosy. Being stubborn and nosy aren't the worst flaws you can have, but they have cost me most of my relationships over the years. This gives me a lot of free time. I have been selling stuff, mostly original comic art, at horror and sci-fi conventions for 20 years. 20 years of pestering the other vendors for a copy of an episode of this show. Usually conventions are amazing for lost media like this. I have a 4K print of the unaltered versions of the original trilogy, and a VHS with what appears to be an authentic 20 minutes of London After Midnight. But I could never find a copy of this show. 3 months ago, at the big con in San Diego, a pink-haired girl in her mid-20s came to my booth. She was holding a disc with the show's name on it. I didn't have a DVD player with me, or at home, not for 10 years, but she only wanted $20 for it. I don't know how she knew who I was or that I was looking for the show, but she looked incredibly familiar, which made no sense. I didn't know any women her age, pink-haired or otherwise. When I got the disc home and finally found a laptop to play it, I understood where I knew her from. She was the girl without the guitar. Her clothes and hair were obviously different, but she hadn't changed in 40 years. When the roster came around, I was sort of expecting it, but it still felt like there was ice going down my spine when they said both of my names. Obviously, at this point, the logical thing to do was just put my guitar in the yard. But I'm stubborn and nosy. I woke up screaming on my bathroom floor. I don't know how I got there. Even immediately after I woke up, I couldn't remember the prince's face, only his hand. The 6 fingers ending in long nails that burned like candles. So the next night, I put a 1974 black Fender Telecaster Custom, same model that Keith hit a fan with on the Stones' '81 tour, outside in the yard with my letter. I live alone and was more freaked out than curious. I left the television on for company. Around 3 a.m., I woke up with the sense that I was being watched. The TV was an old-school snowy screen, like we would get when the cable went out. Then the hand rose up from the side of my bed. I don't know if I screamed. I only know that I froze. It came up slowly, no particular hurry, the fingernail candles casting shadows against the wall. It stank of soil and decay. It didn't move like a person. It didn't move like anything in this world. Even in my terrified state, I was able to recognize it. It was claymation. I didn't bother getting dressed before running for my keys and wallet and bolting out of the house. I ended up at White Castle, the only place open, frantically doing an image search. I was filled with cosmic dread, but I was still stubborn and nosy. I found it right away. I was right. The thing that was in my bedroom was the old intro animation from the Saturday Night Horror movie on the same channel that aired the show. A 6-fingered hand rising from a creepy swamp. When the sun came up, I went home to find my guitar exactly where I left it. My offering had been rejected. Of course it was. I had tried to cheat. Later, I would go into the yard dragging the thing I really loved the most. The only painting my dad ever finished, a lighthouse at the cusp of a storm, guiding the ships in. I have had it on my wall my entire life. The following morning it was gone, along with my note. That night, there was a package at my door. I opened it and found 3 photo albums. Once I knew that the whole thing was real, I could have asked for anything in the note I left. If the grinning prince could appear in my dreams, and the host of the show could appear ageless, then I could ask to be rich, or young, or immortal, or whatever. That's not how I'm wired, though. For my gift, I wanted 3 answers. What was the point of the show? Why did it stop? What happened to the kids who couldn't or wouldn't leave the offering? I sat on my couch and opened the first album. 1970s pale gold and olive tones shine in the pictures. I saw the hosts, their names, their real names, not the ones from the show, were handwritten above them. Carmen and Patricia. I touched the picture and suddenly I'm not me. I'm Carmen. We are puppeteers. It is 1971, and we are in NYC trying to get a job with the public television kids show that has somehow become a huge hit. Our manager gets us an interview with a local channel. Station management pitches us on our own show. But there are rules, very specific rules. We have to prove our loyalty to station management. We have to pledge ourselves to the smiling presence lurking behind everything. It seems like a game. Patricia and I sacrificed the puppets we made ourselves in 6th grade. We promise each other that we will ask for the same gift, for our show to go on forever. I don't know what Patricia really asked for. It wasn't to stay young. At her wake, she was an old lady, and I was the same, like always. My mind is as fresh as my body. I can't forget anything we did. I hear every kid's name that I called. I see the ones that didn't listen. I snap the book shut and open the second one. This one isn't just pictures. It is a collage of 80s and 90s photos, newspaper clippings, magazine articles. They swirl into a vivid montage of what happened after the show stopped. It wasn't needed anymore. One generation of kids in one city was enough. 4 names called a day, 5 days a week, for 10 years. Every kid grew up to serve the prince in their own way. They gave him other names and made up party games to summon him. They put him in 80s album covers and 90s comic books and 2000s creepypasta. They even backwards masked a worship service into a Philadelphia-based teen dance show, also not on YouTube. Every bit helped. All things serve the grinning prince. I haven't opened the last album. Not yet. I can just leave it. I don't have to know what happened to the other kids, the ones who wouldn't listen. Nothing good can come from seeing this, but I'm stubborn and nosy.